The chairs were empty. Not one, not two. Every single seat assigned to the human delegation sat untouched, the terminals dark, the name plates clean, the water glasses still sealed in their paper wraps. I stood at the entrance to the grand chamber and counted them. 14 chairs. 14 empty spots in a room built to hold 400. And yet those 14 empty spots were the only thing anyone was looking at. I am Verath Salyun, a junior liaison officer assigned to the Velthari seat at the Interstellar Council. I had worked this chamber for 6 years. I had seen delegations arrive late. I had seen ambassadors argue so loudly that the translation filters could not keep up. I had seen the Torathi walk out once over a trade clause that was later found to be a typographical error. But I had never, not once in 6 years, seen the human section sit completely empty with no warning, no notice, and no explanation filed to the session desk. The session was supposed to begin at the 9th hour. It was now past the 10th. Director Malvin, the presiding officer, had already called for silence twice. Both times the chamber had gone quiet, and both times it had begun filling with whispered conversation again when no human delegate walked through the doors. I moved to my station and pulled up the attendance registry. The humans had a perfect record. In 11 years of council membership, they had never missed a session without prior notice. They had attended through a solar event that knocked out half the communication relays. They had attended during the Pelari dispute when half the station was sealed. They had sent a single representative, a quiet woman named Ada Croft, to a session that most delegations had boycotted in protest 3 years ago. She had sat alone in the human section, filed her reports, and left without speaking to anyone. So where were they now? I sent a routine ping to the human delegation's internal office line. The response was automated. The message said that the human delegation to the Interstellar Council was currently in a period of operational review and that all inquiries would be addressed through official filing channels. It did not say when. It did not say by whom. Director Malvin finally stood. He was an old man by Velthari standards, with gray along his temples and the careful posture of someone who had spent decades navigating rooms full of people who disagreed with each other. He looked at the empty human section once, only once, and then he looked away. That small movement told me everything. He had already been briefed. He just did not want to say it out loud. "The session will proceed," he said. "Absent delegations are noted in the record." There was a murmur. Ambassador Delrin of the Korasi Collective leaned toward her aide and said something low and fast. Across the chamber, the Pelari cluster of delegates shifted in their chairs. These were not people who were comfortable with surprises. I spent the next 20 minutes doing what junior liaison officers do when they do not know what else to do. I worked. I pulled up every filed document from the human delegation in the last 30 days and I started reading. Most of it was routine. Attendance confirmations, budget reports, a motion filed 6 weeks ago requesting a review of the medical aid allocation to the Seth border worlds. That motion had been assigned to a subcommittee. The subcommittee had not yet met. Then I found it. It was buried in the intake log under a timestamp from 47 hours ago, filed at a time when most of the administrative staff would have been off rotation. It was a single document, 3 paragraphs long, formatted in perfect council standard, every citation correctly formatted, every procedural reference accurate. It was titled Notice of Indefinite Observational Withdrawal. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time because I thought I was misunderstanding something. But I was not misunderstanding anything. The language was plain. The human delegation was not resigning its seat. It was not severing ties with the council. It was simply notifying the administrative body that effective immediately, the human delegation would be suspending active participation in all council proceedings pending an internal review of the value of continued engagement. The notice said that no council functions would be disrupted by this withdrawal. It said that all existing treaty obligations remained in effect. It said that the human delegation could be reached through official filing channels. It was the most polite, most carefully worded, most legally airtight removal of an entire species from active council business that I had ever read. I looked up from my terminal. The session was still going. Director Malvin was managing a procedural vote on port access rights at Tellon Station. 14 chairs sat empty on the far side of the chamber, and somewhere in the stack of administrative intake documents that nobody had flagged, this notice had been sitting for nearly 2 full days. I flagged it. I sent it to my direct supervisor, Senior Liaison Oravel. I sent a copy to the director's office. Then I sat back and waited, because the only thing I knew for certain at that moment was that whatever came next was going to be much larger than an empty section and a missed session. My supervisor walked into my station 4 minutes after I sent the flag. Oravel was a careful, methodical person who did not like being surprised. The way she looked at my screen told me she had not known about the notice either. She read it twice, the same way I had. Then she straightened up and said, in a very even voice, "Find out when this was received and who signed the intake." It took me 20 minutes to trace the intake. The notice had been received by a junior administrative clerk on the night rotation. He had stamped it, logged it, and forwarded it to the standard document queue, which was processed in batches each morning. The morning processor had flagged it as a routine internal communication and routed it to the Council Records Archive rather than to active correspondence. This was technically correct. There was no official category for a notice of this kind, because nobody had ever filed one before. The document had been sitting in the archive, correctly logged, correctly filed, and completely unseen by anyone with the authority to act on it, for 2 days. When I brought this information to Aura, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "The humans knew that would happen." I thought about that. I thought about the timestamp, filed in the middle of the night rotation, formatted to match routine administrative intake, every procedural field filled in correctly, which meant it would not be flagged as incomplete, but nothing in its content or title would cause an automated system to escalate it to urgent review. The humans had filed this notice in a way that guaranteed it would be found, but not immediately. They had given the council just enough time to start the session before anyone realized what the document actually said. Not an accident, not a careless oversight, a deliberate, precise choice. I returned to the chamber floor for the afternoon session. The empty chairs were still empty. A few delegates had begun to look at them less and less, which is what people do when they are trying to convince themselves that a problem does not require their immediate attention. Director Malvin ran the session efficiently. Votes were cast. Reports were received. The record would show a completely functional meeting. But the record would also show, in a small notation at the bottom of the attendance log, that the human delegation had been absent. And if anyone read the archive, they would find the notice. And if anyone read the notice carefully, they would understand that the humans had not left in anger or confusion or haste. They had left the way you leave when you have already said everything and nobody listened. I stayed at my station long after the session ended. The chamber emptied. The other delegates filed out in their clusters, talking quietly. The cleaning staff came through and straightened the chairs. Every chair except the 14 in the human section, which were already perfectly straight because nobody had sat in them. I pulled up the human delegation's full complaint record. I wanted to understand what they had been filing before this happened. I told myself it was due diligence. I told myself it was my job. I think I already knew, somewhere in the part of my mind that recognized patterns, that what I was going to find would not be comfortable to read. The first complaint in the record was dated 11 months ago. It concerned a resolution on emergency supply routing to the Seth border worlds. The resolution had been sponsored by the human delegation and seconded by the Pelari. It had been assigned to a scheduling committee, which had placed it in a review queue. The review queue had a current estimated wait time of 14 months. People were going without medicine on the Seth border worlds. The human delegation had noted this in their complaint. They had attached an updated mortality report from the Seth Regional Health Authority. They had asked for the resolution to be advanced on the schedule. The scheduling committee had sent back a form letter acknowledging receipt of the complaint and noting that all queue adjustments required a 2/3 vote of the full scheduling board, which met quarterly. The next meeting was in 9 weeks. I kept reading. There were more complaints. Some were about procedural delays. Some were about vote counts that did not add up correctly and had been quietly corrected without notification. One complaint, filed 8 months ago, was about a trade agreement between the Korasi Collective and the Torathi that appeared to have been negotiated during a council recess in a way that created a tariff structure directly disadvantaging human cargo routes. The complaint cited 4 specific treaty clauses. It asked for a review panel. The review panel had been formed. It had met twice. Its findings had been submitted to the council secretariat. The findings had not yet been placed on a session agenda. I read for 3 hours. By the time I was done, I had found 47 separate complaints filed by the human delegation over the past 11 months. Some were small. Some were significant. Every single one had received a response. Every single response had been procedurally correct. Every single complaint had been logged, acknowledged, assigned, and then quietly set aside. Not refused, not rejected, just set aside. I sat in the empty chamber for a while after that. The lights had shifted to their low evening setting. Outside the observation panels, the station lights were coming on, orange and white against the dark. I thought about what it would feel like to sit in a room and say the same thing, 47 times, in 47 different careful and correct ways, and to have each version of that thing received politely and placed on a shelf. I thought about the notice, 3 paragraphs, filed at night, buried in the intake queue. The humans had not slammed a door. They had closed it behind them quietly, and they had done it in a way that meant the council would not feel the draft until they had been gone for 2 full days. I filed my daily report and went home. I did not sleep well. The next morning I arrived at my station early. There was already a meeting notice from Director Malvin's office waiting for me. Emergency convening of the senior liaison staff. 7th hour. Attendance required. It was the 5th hour. I had 2 hours to think about what was going to happen next. I spent them reading the humans' trade filings. The meeting was held in the director's secondary conference room, which was smaller and more private than the main session chamber. There were 12 people in the room. Director Malvin stood at the head of the table. Oravel sat 2 seats to my left. Most of the faces were senior staff. I was the most junior person present by several rank grades, which meant Aura had specifically requested my attendance, which meant she wanted someone who had read the intake record and could speak to it directly. Director Malvin did not waste time on pleasantries. He opened by saying that he had been briefed on the withdrawal notice and that he needed a clear picture of what it meant operationally. He wanted to know if the human delegation's absence from active participation would affect any current council functions. There was a short silence. Then the head of the Logistics Coordination Office, a senior officer named Bren Salath, said that she had been pulling operational dependency records since the early morning. She looked at her notes carefully before she spoke. She said that the human delegation's administrative staff provided coordination support for 3 active relay scheduling agreements. She said that one of those agreements covered communication routing for the outer Pelari territories and was currently mid-cycle, meaning it would require a renewal authorization in approximately 6 weeks. She said that the staff contact for that authorization was a human administrative officer, and that she had not yet been able to confirm whether that officer was still reachable through normal channels. Director Malvin asked her to find out. She said she would. Then the head of the document processing office said that 2 council database licenses were registered under human administrative accounts. One was a medical reference database used by the station health authority and shared under a council-wide access agreement. The other was a cargo manifest system used by the port authority for scheduling clearances. Both licenses were current, but both renewal cycles would occur within the next 4 months, and the renewal contacts were listed as human delegation staff. There was another silence, longer this time. I looked at the people around the table. These were experienced, intelligent individuals. They were not panicking, but I could see, in the way they held their pens and looked at their notes without quite looking at each other, that they were doing the same calculation I had done the night before. They were trying to figure out how deep this went. Director Malvin asked me to summarize the withdrawal notice and the complaint record. I did. I went through the key points clearly and without editorializing. 47 complaints, 11 months, every complaint correctly processed and set aside. A notice filed in a procedurally correct way that guaranteed a 2-day delay before discovery. Legal withdrawal of active participation, not resignation of membership. All treaty obligations explicitly confirmed as remaining in force. When I finished, the room was very quiet. Director Malvin looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up and said, "Is there anything in their filing record that indicates what they want?" I said that the notice did not specify conditions for returning to active participation. It said only that the delegation was conducting an internal review of the value of continued engagement. He nodded slowly. I said, carefully, that the complaint record suggested that the human delegation had been trying to communicate several specific concerns over the past 11 months, and that none of those concerns had been formally resolved. He looked at me for a moment, not unkindly, but with the kind of measured attention that meant he was deciding how much weight to assign to what I had said. He said we would reconvene the following morning. He asked Bren Saleth to complete the operational dependency audit by then. He asked the document office to compile a full list of any council function that had a human administrative point of contact. Then he dismissed the meeting. I walked back to my station with Oravel. She did not say anything until we were away from the others. Then she said, quietly, "How many complaints did you say there were?" I said 47. She said, "How many of them were about things that were actually wrong?" I thought about the mortality report. I thought about the trade agreement tariffs. I thought about the resolution that had been sitting in a review queue for 11 months while people on the Seth border worlds waited for medicine. I said most of them. She did not respond to that. She just nodded once and walked to her own station. The operational audit was finished by the following morning, and it was worse than anyone in that conference room had been prepared for. Bren Saleth presented the findings. She had stayed through most of the night. I could see it in her face, the particular kind of tiredness that comes not from lack of sleep, but from reading something unpleasant for too many hours in a row. She had a summary document loaded on the main display. She walked through it section by section, and with each section the room became quieter. The relay scheduling system was the first issue. Human administrative staff had been managing the coordination layer between the Council's communication relay network and the independent relay operators who leased access to the grid. This was not glamorous work. It involved logging contracts, confirming renewal windows, flagging timing conflicts, and maintaining the master schedule that kept traffic from colliding across 11 active relay chains. No single relay operator handled the whole thing. The human staff had been the connective layer. Without someone actively managing that coordination layer, the schedule would begin to drift. Bren estimated that within 3 weeks, the first timing conflicts would start appearing. Within 6 weeks, some relay chains would begin operating on incompatible cycles. The cargo system was the second issue. The license itself was active, But the cargo manifest database was structured around a permission architecture that human administrators had built and maintained. 3 of the 6 permission tiers required manual authorization from a licensed account holder to process non-standard cargo requests. The human delegation staff were the account holders. If they stopped responding to authorization requests, the Port Authority would begin experiencing processing backlogs within 10 days. The medical database was the third issue, and in some ways the one that had made people go most quiet. The database itself ran on independent infrastructure and would not go offline, but the data synchronization protocol that kept it updated with new entries from member worlds had been configured by a human technical officer 18 months ago. The synchronization ran through a set of automated credentials that were, technically, still active. But the technical officer who had built the system, and who was the only person who fully understood how to modify the configuration, was a human delegation staff member. If anything in the sync protocol needed to be adjusted, repaired, or updated, there was currently no one in the Council's own technical staff who knew the system well enough to do it without assistance. Director Malvin asked how this situation had developed. He asked it neutrally, without accusation in his voice, but the question itself was an admission. How had the Council come to rely on human administrative labor for this many critical functions without those dependencies being formally documented and protected by contract? Bren said that most of these roles had developed informally over several years. She said that human staff members had a reputation for being reliable and thorough, and that when a function needed to be handled, they had frequently volunteered for it. She said that many of these roles had never been formally categorized as essential council positions because they had originated as temporary assistants that simply never ended. The room was very quiet for a moment. I thought about that word, volunteered. I thought about 47 complaints sitting in a queue. The director asked what immediate steps could be taken. There was a discussion about approaching human administrative staff directly to ask for a transition briefing. Someone suggested that the withdrawal notice did not technically prohibit individual human employees from being contacted on operational matters. Someone else noted that the human delegation's automated response specifically routed all inquiries through official filing channels, which meant that any direct contact outside those channels might be seen as an attempt to circumvent the withdrawal process. Nobody wanted to be the one to make that situation worse. By the end of the meeting, it had been decided that the Council would prepare a formal inquiry through the official filing channels, requesting a transition briefing on all operational functions currently managed by human staff. Director Malvin would sign the inquiry personally. It would be submitted that afternoon. The response came back in less than 4 hours. It was 3 sentences long. It acknowledged receipt of the inquiry. It said that the human delegation was currently reviewing all operational functions and would provide information through official channels in due course. It said that all existing automated systems remained active and that no deliberate disruption of council functions had occurred or was planned. That last sentence was technically true. That was the part that made it difficult to argue with. The relay coordination system was not sabotaged. The cargo database license was not revoked. The medical sync protocol was not shut down. The human staff had not done anything. They had simply stopped doing things, and the things they had stopped doing were things they had never been formally required to do in the first place. Over the next 4 days, I watched the Council try to solve a problem it had no clean procedure for handling. The legal staff reviewed the withdrawal notice repeatedly and confirmed each time that it was procedurally valid. There was no mechanism to compel the human delegation to return to active participation. Council membership was voluntary. The withdrawal was not a breach of any treaty. The humans had been scrupulously careful about that. The technical staff attempted to reconstruct the relay scheduling system from existing records. They managed to identify the core timing architecture, but found gaps in the documentation that the human staff had maintained in internal logs that were no longer being shared. The gaps were not catastrophic, but they were significant enough that Bren Saleth declined to certify the reconstructed schedule as operationally reliable. The Cargo Port Authority requested an emergency meeting with the Council's Secretariat to discuss the authorization backlog. Non-standard cargo requests had begun to pile up. Most of them were not urgent. A few were. The port director was very controlled in her tone during the meeting, but I noticed she used the word unsustainable twice. On the fifth day, Director Malvin authorized the formation of a delegation team to travel to Meridian Station, which was the human administrative hub in this sector and the location of the human delegation's primary operations office. The goal was direct engagement, not a demand, not a confrontation, a conversation. I was selected to be part of the delegation. Ora told me it was because I had read all the files. The delegation consisted of 7 people. Director Malvin led it himself, which was unusual enough that every senior staff member I passed on the way to the transport bay gave me a look that said they understood this was serious. We also had the head of the legal staff, the head of operations, 2 senior liaison officers, a communications officer, and me. Meridian Station was a 6-hour transit from the council's primary platform. I spent most of the journey reading. I reread the 47 complaints. I looked at the dates and the responses and the status fields that said things like under review and pending scheduling and referred to subcommittee. I looked at the mortality report that had been attached to the emergency supply resolution. The numbers in that report were not abstract. They were documented cases, sorted by region and medical category, covering a period of 14 months. The human delegation had filed that report as supporting evidence for a resolution that had been sitting in a queue for 11 months. I closed the file about 2 hours before we arrived. I looked out the transit window at the stars and thought about what we were actually going to say when we got there. We were going to ask them to come back. We were going to do it politely and officially, and with the full authority of the director's office behind us. We were going to present it as a practical matter of operational continuity, because that was the framing that felt the most manageable. We were going to try not to make it sound like a request, because we did not want to be in the position of admitting that we needed them. But we did need them. That was the part nobody was comfortable saying out loud. We needed them not because of the relay schedules or the cargo database or the medical sync protocol. Those were symptoms. We needed them because we had spent 11 years treating their participation as ambient, like weather, like gravity, like something that simply existed without anyone having to earn it or maintain it or deserve it. And they had stopped. Meridian Station was larger than I expected. I had seen the registry entry before, but registry entries do not prepare you for the physical reality of a working hub. The docking bay was busy. The corridors beyond customs were wide and clean and moving with purpose. There were humans and non-humans both, but the humans moved with the particular efficiency of people who were fully in charge of their own environment and knew it. We were met by an administrative coordinator named Hadley Cross. He was young, no older than mid-career, with dark hair and the kind of calm that reads as either very confident or very prepared. He greeted the director personally, checked our identification through the proper protocols, and then guided us to a meeting room on the 4th level. The meeting room was comfortable but not extravagant. A table, 8 chairs, water on the table, a display panel on the wall. Hadley Cross offered us water and then stepped out. He came back 4 minutes later with a woman I recognized from the delegation file photos. Her name was Sable Marsh. She was the Senior Administrative Director for the Human Delegations Operations Office on Meridian Station. She had worked in the human delegation structure for 19 years. I had seen her name on several of the complaint filings, which meant she had either signed or reviewed most of the 47 documents. She sat down across from Director Malvin. She was pleasant. She offered more water. She asked about the transit and whether the team had experienced any difficulty with the docking procedures. She was not warm in the way that was designed to make you relax. She was warm in the way of someone who had excellent manners and intended to use them. Director Malvin thanked her for receiving us on short notice. He said the council was concerned about the disruption to operational continuity caused by the withdrawal, and that he had come personally, because he believed the matter required direct dialogue. Sable Marsh listened to this with complete attention. When he finished, she said, "Thank you, Director. I appreciate you making the journey. I want to be clear that no disruption was intended, and I want to confirm again that all automated systems remain active. We have not taken any action to interfere with council functions." Malvin said he understood that, and that the council's concern was forward-looking. He said that certain operational functions were managed by human delegation staff, and that the council was uncertain how to ensure continuity of those functions, given the current status of the delegation's participation. She nodded. She said, "I understand. Those are legitimate operational concerns and we want to help address them." She paused and then she said, "I want to be equally clear, however, that the roles you're describing were never formal contractual obligations of the human delegation. They developed informally over time, and our staff filled them because they needed to be filled, and we had the capability to fill them. There is no existing agreement requiring us to continue performing them, and the internal review currently underway will be determining which of those informal arrangements we choose to continue, and under what terms going forward." Malvin said he appreciated the clarity and asked whether there was a timeline for the internal review's conclusions. She said there was not a fixed timeline. He asked whether the human delegation would be willing to provide a transition briefing for each of the operational roles currently held by human staff, so that council staff could be trained to take over if necessary. She said that the delegation was happy to consider that request, and that they would evaluate which briefings would be feasible to provide given current staff workloads. This continued for about 40 minutes. Every offer Malvin made was received graciously. Every question he asked was answered clearly. And yet, by the end of it, nothing had been agreed to and nothing had been committed. Not because Sable Marsh was being evasive. She was not. She was being exactly as cooperative as she needed to be and not 1 degree more. At one point, the head of the council's legal staff, a veteran officer named Pren Dath, said carefully that the council hoped the human delegation would consider resuming active participation in council proceedings, and asked whether there were specific conditions or concerns that would need to be addressed for that to occur. Sable Marsh looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "The withdrawal notice specifies that the delegation is reviewing the value of continued engagement. That review is ongoing." Pren said, "Is there anything the council could do to address concerns that have been raised previously?" She said, "All of our concerns have been filed through proper channels. The records are available in the council archive." There was a pause. Pren said, "Yes, we have reviewed those records." She said, "Good." That was the end of that line of conversation. On the transit back, the director sat at the front of the cabin and looked out the window for most of the journey. The rest of us talked quietly, the way people do when they are processing something and not yet sure what conclusions they have reached. I sat near the back. The head of operations, a steady woman named Calla Fenn, sat across from me. She had not said much during the meeting. Now she looked at me and said, she knew everything those complaint filings said. I said yes, I believed she did. Calla said she was waiting to see if we had read them. I thought about Pren's question. Is there anything the council could do to address concerns that have been raised previously? And Sable's answer, All of our concerns have been filed through proper channels. The records are available in the council archive. And then, good. She had wanted to know if we had actually looked, if someone had finally bothered to open the filing and read what was inside. And when Pren confirmed it, she had not said anything more, because she did not need to. The acknowledgement itself was the thing she had been waiting for. I said she was not asking us to do anything in that meeting. She was making sure we understood the sequence. Kala looked at me. I said they filed the complaints. The complaints were ignored. They withdrew. We came to ask them to come back. And in the process of asking them to come back, we confirmed that we had read the complaints. That was the first time in 11 months that anyone from the council side of this table acknowledged that those documents existed and contained valid concerns. Kala was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And if we had come here without reading them?" I said, "I think the meeting would have been shorter." We landed back at the council platform in the late evening. I went straight to my station. There was a message from Aura waiting for me. She wanted a full summary of the meeting for the director's morning briefing. I sat down and started writing. I wrote for a long time. I wrote about the meeting, but I also wrote about the complaint record, because the two things could not be separated. I wrote about what I had found in the archive and what it meant that it had been sitting there for 11 months without anyone senior enough to act on it ever reading it. I wrote carefully. I tried to be accurate without being unkind. I tried to describe what had happened without placing blame in a way that would make the report easier to dismiss. At the end, I attached all 47 complaint filings as appendices. I labeled the attachment clearly: supporting documentation, human delegation complaint record, months 1 through 11. Then I sent it and sat back. The morning session of the council began at the 9th hour as always. The human section was empty, as it had been for 6 days now. Director Malvin opened the session. The agenda moved forward. Business was conducted. At the 2nd hour of the session, the director paused the agenda. He said that he wished to submit a report to the full council and asked for permission to place it on the official record. The vote to allow it was unanimous, which in a council session meant that everyone present had decided that whatever was about to happen, they did not want to be the one who blocked it. He read from my report. He read the key points. He described the complaint record. He described the operational dependency audit. He described the meeting on Meridian Station. He read the summary carefully, and he did not soften the parts that were uncomfortable. When he finished, the chamber was quiet in a way I had not heard before. Not the quiet of boredom or inattention. The quiet of a room full of intelligent people who have just been told something they could not argue with and had not yet figured out what to do with it. Then he did the thing I had not expected. He stood and he reached into the document case at his station, and he walked to the center of the chamber floor. The center of the floor was where formal submissions were made, where treaties were signed, where motions of significant weight were placed into the council's physical record. He set down a stack of documents. Then he straightened up and said, "These are the 47 complaints filed by the human delegation of this council over the past 11 months. They are now formally entered into the council's session record. They will be addressed. Each one will receive a formal council response before the next full session. The subcommittee responsible for the medical aid resolution will be convened within 5 days. The trade agreement review panel will be given a session date within the next 2 weeks. He paused. He said, "I want to note for the record that these complaints were filed through proper channels, were received, were processed, and were not acted upon. That is a failure of this council's processes, and it is this council's responsibility to address." Another pause, longer this time. He said, "Whether or not the human delegation chooses to return to active participation is their decision to make. We will not pressure them. We will not make demands. What we will do is correct what was wrong, because that is what we should have done 11 months ago." He walked back to his station and sat down. The chamber remained quiet for several more seconds. Then, slowly, the session resumed. I sat at my station and looked at the empty human chairs. I thought about Sable Marsh's face when Pren had confirmed that the council had read the complaints. The way she had said good and then stopped, because there was nothing more to say at that moment. Not forgiveness, not a resolution, just the first acknowledgement in 11 months that the record existed. I did not know if they would come back. I did not know when or on what terms. I did not know how long the internal review would take, or what conditions the human delegation would set, or whether the corrections the director had promised would be enough to matter. What I knew was this. For 11 months, a delegation had sat in this chamber and done its work and filed its complaints and attended every session and maintained every system and volunteered for every role that needed filling. It had done all of this while being heard and not listened to, while being acknowledged and not addressed, while being useful in ways that had never been named or valued or protected by any formal agreement. And then it had left, quietly, in the middle of the night, in a document that was filed perfectly correctly and buried just long enough that the council would feel its absence before it understood its cause. The pain was not in the departure. The pain was in what the departure made visible. 47 documents on a table in the center of the council floor. Years of work that had been treated as ambient. A medical database syncing on credentials that nobody else understood. A relay schedule maintained by people whose roles had never been written down. All of it there, all along in the record, waiting for someone to read it. The empty chairs did not feel like an absence anymore. They felt like a question, sitting very still, waiting to see what answer the council was finally ready to give. I stayed at my station until the session ended. I filed my daily report. I made sure the 47 documents were correctly cross-referenced in the session record. I did the small, careful, necessary work of making sure that this time, nothing would get lost in the queue. Then I turned off my terminal and walked out through the empty chamber, past the 14 empty chairs, and out into the corridor where the station lights were already warm and orange against the dark. The question was still sitting there behind me. I hoped we were ready to answer it.
I missed that one. It's good, it's good.